Hi, welcome back to Busch History. This is topic 5. Topic 5 is going to deal with the Federalist Era. So I'm primarily going to be addressing the administration of George Washington and the administration of John Adams. Every once in a while history comes along with someone who is just in the right place at the right time and has just the right characteristics. And that person is certainly George Washington. He deserves every accolade that he's ever received from every historian who's written about him. Did he want to become president? Well, it's kind of hard to decide that. In terms of being general of the Continental Army, well, at the Continental Congress, prior to the Declaration of Independence, he showed up every day wearing his uniform from the French and Indian War, but then denied he was campaigning to be general of the Continental Army. So he leads the Continental Army through the American Revolution, and we win. And then we have the whole Newburgh Address scenario, where he turns down a chance to once again lead the nation as general of the army in kind of an emperor dictatorship role. We have the Articles of Confederation, the necessary mistake, and the critical period in which the country's kind of going sideways. And then we end up in the Constitutional Convention, and George Washington is unanimously nominated to be President of the United States. And of course he accepts. And in 1789, George Washington will be the first President of the United States after unanimously winning the election in 1788 at the Constitutional Convention. And that's what we're going to pick up today. We're going to take a look at George Washington's administration. George Washington claimed that he was not a Federalist, that he did not have any party. As a matter of fact, he disagreed with political parties. But as head of the first federal government in the United States, it should be hard not to call him a Federalist. And John Adams will be his vice president. So this period from 1789 through up until 1801, with the inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, is known as the Federalist Era, or some people call it the New Republic. Whatever you want to call it, it's really when the United States starts to get its feet and starts to grow into the nation that we are today, as we put a lot of precedents in place, and as George Washington sets a lot of the tone for how the nation is going to continue. So let me cue this up, and we'll walk through the Washington presidency and the Adams presidency. So as I said, this is going to be topic 5, and topic 5 is available at buschhistory.net/YouTube. This PowerPoint will be there, and some of the notes that I will refer to will be in that folder as well. So go to the Busch History website, and you'll find the companion notes that go along with this PowerPoint. As I said, this is going to be called the Federalist Era. The Federalist Era goes from 1789, actually until 1801. We have the election of 1800 when the Federalists will lose to the Democratic Republicans headed by Thomas Jefferson. In either case, this is the beginning of the country that you and I know today. So we have President Washington. 1789 is inaugurated April 30, 1789 at Federal Hall in New York City. New York was the capital of the United States at the time, and George Washington set many precedents as President of the United States because he's first. So all of his decisions are pretty much precedents. The first thing he does is he appoints a cabinet. Now, the cabinet is not in the Constitution. If the cabinet's not in the Constitution, well, how does he do it? Well, he does it because there's something called implied powers. The president is allowed to have advisors in the Constitution. And sure enough, he picks an all-star group of gentlemen who are going to help him get this government on its feet. First of all, he picks Henry Knox, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Edmund Randolph to be in his original cabinet. Now, of those 4, the 2 most important are going to be Thomas Jefferson, who will be Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, who will be Secretary of the Treasury, I should say. And they are diametrically opposed to each other. Remember, Thomas Jefferson is not a constitutionalist. He is not really a Federalist. And Alexander Hamilton is one of the architects of the Constitution. So George Washington has really put some adversaries in his original cabinet, but those adversaries will give him differing points of view. The other thing Washington establishes is the 2-term limit. There is nothing in the Constitution, the original Constitution, about 2 terms. The only thing it says is that a president's term will be 4 years. It doesn't give any kind of limit to it. So President Washington serves 2 terms and then says, I'm not going to run again, I'm tired, it's time for somebody else. That sets the groundwork for that 2-term practice, which will continue all the way up until Franklin Roosevelt, when he's elected in 1933 and then will be elected, 1932, I'm sorry, begins his term in 1933, and then will be elected 3 more times for a total of 4. So Washington becomes president, and there's a lot of things he has to do to get going. First of all, the Article 3 of the Constitution deals with the judiciary branch. There's not a lot there. It's about 1.5 pages in most books. So there's a lot of stuff that's vague on the judiciary. So the first thing that happens is Washington signs the Judiciary Act of 1789. And that act sets up the court system in the United States. It creates the federal system, which we're talking about, the circuit courts, the courts of appeals, ultimately the Supreme Court. And it also sets up the idea of the judicial review. But this is philosophy, not practice. Will the courts be able to review laws as passed by Congress? Will they be able to review laws that are signed into play by the President of the United States? That's the idea, but it actually has to happen. The Judiciary Act also sets up the idea that the President will appoint judges to the Supreme Court. It does not state how many judges. So once again, we're a little vague and it's a little wide open here. Other very important legislation, 1791, we get the Bill of Rights. This is that sweet, sweet deal that I refer to constantly, that I always wonder, would it happen today if we had the opportunity? In order to get the Constitution ratified, the Federalists had a promise, the Anti-Federalists, that they would codify their rights to prevent this omnipotent, overpowering government from taking their rights away. So what happened was, the series of grievances that occurred in the Declaration of Independence became the basis for the Bill of Rights. And in 1791, the Federalists kept their promise. They codified these rights. And that was a great thing. They wrote them down, and they became known as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And they really limit the power of the federal government. The Bill of Rights, very, very important. It was adopted during the first session of the new Congress, and initially there were over 200 potential amendments. Yes, they eventually had to get pared down, of course they did. You couldn't have 200 amendments to a brand new Constitution. It would have been kind of ridiculous. But the point remains, this was a sacred deal, and the deal was kept, and those rights are something that all Americans hold near and dear today. Another thing, very controversial, was Hamilton's economic plan. And I'm going to go over that actually at the end of this PowerPoint with actual notes I have on it, which are in the Topic 5 folder on the website. But basically, Hamilton needs to get us on our feet financially. And he needs to raise money for the federal government to operate. Remember, the government of the Arts Confederation did not have the power to directly tax. States tax and could donate money, but the federal government did not have that power. So what happens is, the tariff of 1789 is passed, and this becomes a way for the government to start financing itself. Controversial, because now imported goods are going to be taxed in much the same way that the British tried with their various stamp acts. Anyway, next thing is that the federal government would assume the debts of the states. Now that meant any state debts that had been outstanding from the Revolution or the period after the Revolution would be assumed by the federal government. So if New York has a debt, it no longer has that debt. The federal government has the debt. If New Jersey has a debt, again, the debt is taken over by the federal government. So the state debts become debts of the federal government, which means that the federal government has to raise money to pay those debts. Which means that states that did not have debts would have to pay taxes to pay off the debts of the federal government, who had assumed those debts from the other states. Highly controversial. Most of those debts were owed by the northern states, and southern states didn't owe nearly as much money as northern states did. And that meant that southern states were going to be taxed to pay the debts of their northern brethren. South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, not going for this. Virginia doesn't like it much either. So something had to be offered. what can we offer in terms of a compromise? It was proposed that the capital that was in New York, would be moved to the south on this new piece of land, which would be called the District of Columbia. And it would be named after Washington for a couple of reasons. First of all, first president of the United States, sure. Secondly, he owned the land. It was called Foggy Bottom. George Washington sold the land to the United States government that the Capitol would be built upon. And then he helped design the Capitol. He's kind of like Martha Stewart. He wanted everything a certain way, so he actually designs the framework of the buildings in the Capitol, roughly copying ancient Rome and ancient Greece and some of the capital of Europe in that kind of grandeur. He wanted the Capitol to look dominating when foreign dignitaries came to the United States. So nevertheless, the South is going to get the Capitol in return for the Assumption Plan of Alexander Hamilton. They will pay off the debts of their northern brethren if the capital moves south. So that's how we get Washington, D.C. Anyway, what's also going to come up is the Bank of the United States. This is going to be the first national bank, Hamilton's bank. Hamilton is a genius. Alexander Hamilton is an elitist. He's a Federalist. He believes in a strong class system. However, he's brilliant. Not bad, because his mother was a prostitute in the Caribbean, and he came to the United States to get away from that life. She sent him here. So he comes basically as an orphan, and he's self-trained and self-taught in the United States, and he's going to come up with a plan for our economic system that largely exists today. So the first Bank of the United States is Alexander Hamilton's idea. But the crazy thing is, it's not in the Constitution. How do you get a bank if it's not in the Constitution? Well, you get it the same way Washington got his cabinet. It's implied. If the federal government has the power to tax, it needs to put the money someplace. So where should it put it? In a shoebox? No, it can put it in a bank. Even though the Constitution doesn't say that. It can put it in the bank because it's implied you have to be able to put the money someplace, and the money has to be distributed from someplace. So we get the Bank of the United States. And that bank is going to cause controversy from the day it begins up until present day because of its power and how it affects the American economy. So this theory of implied powers gives way to a term called loose construction. There's strict construction and there's loose construction. Loose construction is an idea adopted by people who believe the Constitution is subject to continual interpretation. And it's not what the words are, but it's what the words intend to be. So this Bank of the United States was very controversial because it involved a loose construction in the Constitution, an interpretation, if you like. And people like Thomas Jefferson didn't like that. He figured that if the Constitution said it, you could do it, and if it didn't say it, you couldn't do it. He was a strict constructionist. Of course, that'll come back to bite him when he decides that purchasing Louisiana to double the size of the United States would be a great idea. So this strict constructionist believes that you do exactly what the Constitution says and no more. And a loose constructionist believes that you can interpret the Constitution and expand its powers when necessary for the good of the nation. And they believe in that theory of implied powers. So then we get the 11th Amendment, another important piece of legislation while President Washington was in office. It actually occurs in 1798. It's right after he leaves, but it was in play. It was being debated while he was president. And the idea was, can you have states suing each other? What was happening was, going back to land claims from the Articles of Confederation, some of the boundaries between states were unclear. And if you happen to own a piece of property that was both in Georgia and in South Carolina, before these lines were straightened out, as a result of the land ordinance and the Northwest Ordinance and the whole idea, let's start surveying land, then what happened was, you're confused and you want all your land to be in one state. So people were trying to sue from state to state. The 11th Amendment prevents that. It basically says the citizens of one state cannot sue another state government. It cleans it up and it makes life a little easier. It goes back to the whole idea of federalism, that you have the superior federal government that handles these disputes. A very important event that occurred during Washington's administration is, what do you do with the relationship with the United States, Great Britain, and the United States and France? Well, we're more like the British in more ways than we can count. We just don't want to be British. However, the French helped us in our Revolutionary War. Yet we don't like monarchies there either. So we have a problem here. And because Britain was the strongest, powerful, most powerful nation in the world, we wanted them as our #1 trading partner because they could help develop the economy of the United States. And let's face it, that's how it all began anyway. It all began with England wanted to trade with North America, with the colonies, so now we're going to give it to them. We're going to give it to them something called Jay's Treaty, basically orchestrated by John Jay. And John Jay gave England what's called most favored nation trading status, which really means that England would be able to trade with the United States freely without impediment. Now, in 1794, that was really controversial because it wasn't too long ago the French came to our aid to help defeat the British, and now we're making our first large international treaty with who? Our former enemy and former dominator, the British. So the French are really pissed off. Let's take a closer look at Jay's Treaty just to make sure we got all of it done. The British are going to take all their troops off our soil. That's going to allow Britain to use its full military might against the French. You got to believe the French aren't thrilled about that. And of course, France is going to get angry with all of that. And what are they going to do? They're going to start seizing our ships, because our ships are providing the British with supplies. It's all very sordid here, and you have to wonder, why did we fight the revolution anyway, just so we'd be best buddies with the British all over again? Well, because it was all economics. Now we control the economics, and the British don't. It had less to do with politics, and less to do with freedom, and more to do with money. Nevertheless, so now the French are going to start seizing our ships on the Atlantic as we're trying to trade with the British, pirating, if you like. And that's called a quasi-war. Well, that's a problem now, because now we're trading with the British, and the French are seizing our ships, but we're supposed to be friends with the French. So there's a problem there as well. So what happens? Charles Pinckney comes up with a great idea. He says, listen, why don't we give the French access to their old stomping ground, to the Ohio Valley? So we negotiate Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. And Pinckney's Treaty is going to turn around and open up the port of New Orleans for international trade. Now, New Orleans and the Louisiana territories we now know belong to Spain at this point. So the treaty is actually with Spain. But Spain has no power here. They have no navy anymore. So this is old land that they can't do anything with anyway. So the treaty is with Spain, because a treaty with France would have caused a problem between us and the British. So the treaty is with Spain. New Orleans is internationalized, which simply means, if you remember what happens next, if we take New Orleans down here as an example, going up we get the Mississippi River. And as we go up with the Mississippi River, we get access to the Ohio Valley. France now has access to the Ohio Valley. So Jay's Pinckney gives most favored nation status to England, and Pinckney's Treaty opens up the Ohio Valley to France, and you would think that this is all going to be fine. It's better, but it's not fine. Because what's now going to happen is we're going to be caught in this triangle between Britain, France, and the United States, and who's going to benefit most from this trade with North America? So, other things we have to consider, we have the French Revolution, 1789. So when the French Revolution occurs, and we're going to turn around here, and who do we support? Let's see, if we support the revolutionaries in France, we are supporting the group that is going to overthrow the king. This is the king, King Louis, this is the king that supported us. Yet, we like revolution to overthrow monarchs because we don't believe in monarchs. But if we support the revolutionaries, we're going against the hand that helped us with King Louis. So the Federalists largely do not support this revolution. We're going to get something called the Citizen Guinée affair, which is going to come up in this time period, which is a French diplomat trying to get support for the French Revolution in the United States. But first the Washington and then the Adams administration are going to pull back from actually supporting the French Revolution. Washington is going to proclaim neutrality. He's going to turn around and say the United States will not form political alliances with other nations in the world, because to choose a friend means to choose an enemy, their enemy. If I'm friends with Britain and Britain is enemies with France, I am enemies with France. Or if I'm friends with France and France is enemies with Britain, I am enemies with Britain. So Washington says, no, neutrality is a much better idea. But understand, this is not trade neutrality. This is political neutrality. We will not form a military alliance with other nations. That's his proclamation of neutrality. We'll trade with everybody, but no military alliances. So then, we move to domestic issues. We have to deal with these Ohio Valley Indians, the same Indians that we tried to get the land from after the French and Indian War. So we're going to have the Indian Intercourse Act. And really what it does is it regulates how we're going to deal with the Native Americans who are living in the Ohio Valley. And it allows for a regulated trade between the various groups. Then we have old John Adams. Well, in 1796 specifically, Washington says he's not going to run for re-election. In 1797, he steps down. And he pretty much anoints John Adams to be the next president of the United States. And John Adams becomes the second president of the United States. He's a Federalist. And Thomas Jefferson's his vice president. And they don't get along. They're good friends, but politically they're very different. So John Adams is going to inherit the throne, if you like, from George Washington. And the thing about this is, John Adams isn't George Washington. He doesn't have the personality. He's an irritating fellow. He's brilliant, but he's annoying. And that's one of the reasons why he was chosen not to write the Declaration of Independence, and Thomas Jefferson was. Because it's not just the message, it's the messenger. And John Adams was not a good messenger. So, in trying to deal with the problems with France, he sends a series of diplomats to try to meet with French emissaries to deal with what's going on in the Atlantic Ocean with the whole quasi-war. And that will become known as the XYZ affair. And the way it plays out was, prior to negotiations, the French diplomats asked for money. The Americans called it a bribe, but historically it's very interesting. Forever, nations in Europe would exchange gifts prior to negotiations. Sometimes it was called tribute. Sometimes they would exchange gold or jewelry. Sometimes they would give a piece of land prior to negotiations. Sometimes they'd give the king's daughter to bring the two sides together. So we're not really sure about this one. American history paints it as they're demanding a bribe, but it's really hard to tell. Was this just normal, a normal way of operating for these French diplomats? Nevertheless, John Adams would not pay. He said, no, we're not going to pay this money to negotiate. We want to negotiate clean. We don't want to have money involved in this negotiation. We want to talk about what's happening on the Atlantic Ocean. And his popularity skyrockets because he's not going to pay the bribe. But what goes up must come down. The other side in Congress were the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans. And they wanted a whole investigation into these bribes. They want to see what's going on here. These French are supposed to be our friends, and they're demanding bribes from us. So John Adams, in an attempt to shield these French diplomats, he changed their names. He just called them X, Y, and Z. Because he didn't want their names publicly known so they could be vilified in the American press and in international politics. Hence, the XYZ affair. Well, the Jeffersonians and Democratic Republicans, they're one and the same in Congress, are screaming and shouting they want Adams' head. They want more information. They think he's hiding something. They think, well, maybe he is paying the money. Of course he's not. But this is all kind of getting out there. And Adams had been so popular about not paying the money. Now his popularity is taking a dent. He's being hit on the side from the Jeffersonians. So let's take a quick look. The French diplomats demanded money to negotiate. Is it a bribe? I don't know. Nevertheless, he doesn't give all the details to Congress. The Federalists in Congress have got to stop the opposition. They want Adams to be re-elected. And they know this is bad press coming to the election of 1800. What they don't understand is the next move is going to cost him the election. Congress, the Federalists control Congress, and Congress is going to pass a series of acts that become known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien has to do with people who are not American citizens, hence aliens. Unfortunately, they still call them that today. And sedition are crimes against the United States along the lines of treason. A crime against your government is a seditious act. So nevertheless, the Federalists passed these two laws. And what they really do is, the Alien Act allows for deportation of people who are speaking out against the United States government who are not yet citizens. And it also extends the amount of time necessary to become a citizen in the United States for all people coming in, for all immigrants. The Sedition Act turns around and says if you speak out against your government, you commit an act against your government, you can be put in jail. So both of these things basically take away the First Amendment. The First First Amendment. John Adams, one of the architects of the Constitution, is going to be put into a corner by the Federalists in Congress, and he is going to usurp the Bill of Rights during his presidency, trying to take away the First Amendment. Well, when he didn't pay the bribe, his popularity went up. When he took away the First Amendment, his popularity crashed. Because now, what is he? Is he a king? Now remember, this is the young days of the Republic. We had only been a country under the Constitution for about 10 years, and this is going on. So Adams looks like he's trying to take control, and the experiment is going to fail. Not the experiment of him taking control, but the experiment of can we actually govern ourselves. Will Adams seize control like this? Will he take away the First Amendment? It doesn't matter what he does, because the Jeffersonians are having a party with it. They're saying, look what he's trying to do. He's trying to take away our rights. He's trying to take away what we fought for. Thomas Jefferson wouldn't do that. Now, to be fair to Thomas Jefferson, he's quiet during the whole thing. He's not saying anything about it. But his agents in Congress are. The Democratic Republicans who do not like John Adams are having a field day with this. And it's really eating into John Adams' popularity. And it's going to cost him the election of 1800. So, Sedition Act made it a criminal act to print or publish false, malicious, or scandalous statements directed against the U.S. government. And the idea was, let's make sure we don't have anyone speaking out against the government. When the Democratic Republicans win in 1800, because this actually costs John Adams the election, when they win in 1800, of course they're going to overturn this. They call this the Peaceful Revolution. It really took 35 ballots in the House of Representatives for Thomas Jefferson to finally be elected president, because it was that close of an election. And John Adams did not even hang around for Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. That's how pissed he was. But nevertheless, XYZ affair, his popularity rises. The Alien Sedition Act, a huge mistake. His popularity falls right down through the toilet, cost him the election of 1800, and we never have another Federalist in the White House. So the Federalist Era, 1789 to 1801, and then, lo and behold, we will have Thomas Jefferson as President of the United States, and we're going to have 24 years, yes, 24 years of Democratic Republican rule in the United States government. It will be known as the Virginia Dynasty, and that will be covered in topic 6. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Other things to consider that occurred during the Washington-Adams administration. You have Mingo Creek. Mingo Creek is in Pennsylvania. This is called the Whiskey Rebellion. Alexander Hamilton placed an excise tax on home-brewed liquor. What that meant was the moonshiners in the mountains were going to have to pay a tax. So this is an idea that goes back as far as time. Let's tax the people who are least able to pay the tax, because they're also least able to resist the government. So the whiskey tax is passed. Now this is somewhat similar to Shays' Rebellion in its test for the national government. Remember, no federal government until the Constitution, because of the power sharing idea. But Washington is going to have to handle this whiskey rebellion idea. Are we going to get these mountain men to pay the tax? Now Washington far oversteps his powers here, because he puts on his uniform, his Revolutionary War uniform. He gets on his white horse named Nelson, and he and Alexander Hamilton lead a group of soldiers into the mountains to collect these taxes. Well, when the mountain men, you know, these guys with the stills in the mountains, see the army coming, they disband. And that is pretty much the end of the Whiskey Rebellion. And it shows that now the federal government has the power to do something about local revolts like this, taxpayer revolts. But it also showed that President Washington would overstep his bounds, because we have civilian control over the military. Military subordination to civilian control. Yet Washington puts on his uniform. You cannot be in the military and be President of the United States. Yes, all for show. No doubt about it. But if you look back at it, it shows that Washington understood the power of the uniform in control. And that is a balance that we've tried to maintain ever since, which is why the President can't be in the military. These basic disagreements lead to the two-party system that Washington was against. They lead to the Federalists and the Republicans. The Federalists, if you remember, they were nationalists who wanted a central government with subordinate state government. The Republicans were the anti-Federalists. They became called the Jeffersonians. Then they called themselves the Democratic Republicans, because they wanted to democratically elect representatives who represented the citizens, a republic. re for represent public citizens, republic. Either case. So that becomes the basis of the two-party system we have today. Federalists wanted a strong central government with subordinate state governments with coercive power, and the federal government would be very hands-on. Republicans wanted state governments to have dominion over most effects in their states, and they wanted very little influence from the federal government. So they wanted a less powerful federal government, if you want. And when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, you'll see what he does to the power of the federal government. And we've been going back and forth ever since. It would be a mistake to say the Federalists are Democrats and these Republicans are the Republicans we have today. That's not true, because the parties changed many times over the years. But this two-party system, this difference of opinion, has its roots right here. How much power will the federal government have? How will they use that power? We also, at this time, way out of left field, we started to have artists painting landscapes. One is called the Hudson River School, but they're painting the history of the United States. What do we know what these places look like? How do we know how they were perceived? Well, art is starting to grow. A uniquely American culture of art is starting to go. And we're getting an architecture, Jeffersonian architecture. This style of building, this big square style of building is called the Jeffersonian look on a building. It's called Jeffersonian architecture. Okay, now I want to show you a set of notes based on Alexander Hamilton's plan, but I'm going to do that in a separate presentation. So we're going to end this here. And this is, remember, this is topic 5, the Federalist Era. It's based on chapter 8 in Faragher's Out of Many, and it's on my website, buschistory.net, as topic 5, as will the next set of notes be. So I'm going to pause here, and topic 5, number 2, will be Hamilton's plan. So hold on one second.